We inhabit a world of information. We walk with it, eat with it, sleep with it. The world has never been so informed. It has also never been so misinformed. Misinformed and disinformed. Polarized into echo chambers. Us, them, propaganda. Propaganda has taken many forms and faces across history. What does it look like in our times? Let's look at the Indian news media.
Hate speech on TV news channels.
Indian TV news has become a battleground of angry arguments.
India was the biggest source of COVID-19 misinformation in the world.
Communal issues, Hindu versus Muslim debates, controversies.
The Supreme Court has come down heavily on TV channels for spreading hate speech.
भारत की पत्रकारिता में स्वर्ण युग तो कभी था भी नहीं, लेकिन आज के दौर की तरह भस्म युग भी नहीं था.
Now we know that the Indian media gone bad is not a news story. It's been around for a while and it's an ongoing story. But is this descent into toxicity an aberration? Or does it tell us something about news media as an institution? Was there ever a time when Indian media was good before it got bad? Or are there certain rules by which media as a system plays by? What does media theory tell us? It's the late 1980s and two American men, Edward S. Herman and Noam Chomsky, publish an institutional analysis of mass media that forever changes the way we look at media. They call it propaganda. They contend that the news media as an institution primarily serves the interests of those in power. What becomes news and what doesn't, what you can and cannot talk about, the limits of the news discourse, all of this serves the priorities of the powerful. And by deciding what the public is allowed to see, hear, and think about, mass media manages public opinion. It manufactures consent. To study this, Herman and Chomsky propose a propaganda model with 5 structural filters. The limits of the system are foremost defined by those who own and control news media. And that's the first filter of the propaganda model: media ownership. India is one of the biggest media markets in the world, but the ownership of its national media is concentrated in the hands of a few private players, large corporations, business families, and individuals. In broadcast television, you have the recent Adani takeover of NDTV, the Ambanis who own Network 18, Subhash Chandra, Zee Media, or Arun Puri, India Today. While in print, you have the Birlas who own HT Media, the Goenkas of Express Group, or the Jains from the Times Group, who, like many others, are key players in multiple media sectors. Now, these conglomerates don't just own media houses. They also have other businesses to run, and most importantly, profits to make. And so multiple conflicts of interest arise. How to run your media business without hurting the commercial gains of your other businesses? Or how to be critical of a government that has significant powers to influence your corporate interests?
Whatever privatizations of public resources that governments do, the biggest beneficiaries are the biggest media owners. So tomorrow, Spectrum is privatized. Who are the gainers? Ambanis, Mittals, Tatas, Birlas. Oil and natural gas are privatized. Mining is privatized.
Therefore, ownership determines what business and political interests the news media caters to. And while the current media regime operates in the extreme,
Clean and clear image.
There is no political match to Modi.
श्री नरेंद्र मोदी इस समय दुनिया भर में सबसे ज्यादा लोकप्रिय नेता हैं.
there is nothing new about a cozy relationship between the government and the media.
Post-independence, because we had come out of an independence movement where everybody thought they were part of nation building, the coziness between newspapers and political leaders was seen as a necessary act of where the nation should go to. And as the political class itself changed from 60s to the early 70s to Indira Gandhi, this coziness becomes complicity, because then you are suddenly supporting an idea which is not about nation building but is about self-building, about political aggrandizement. You have the emergency coming in. The only press that really stands up is the Indian Express, but it has also its political reasons. It's run by a family which is a Jansangh family, so it does not come out of journalistic instincts necessarily, but due to political reasons. And then you have this transition into liberalization. And then you see groups like the Rahejas for Outlook, you see Reliance, which sets up News 18, that you have large businesses which have huge other business interests buying into media. So as a result, and even the old legacy owners, when you look at places like the Hindustan Times, it's the Birlas, they have a huge set of other businesses. The problem this creates is evident because even post-liberalization, we're a semi-liberalized economy. If you have to do your business well, the government has control over licenses, permissions, and 100 other things that they do. So you can't act independently and risk losses in other businesses.
This government-corporate nexus determines media biases, and only those who reflect these interests make it to positions of power within media organizations. The board positions and leadership roles in Indian newsrooms are occupied by the upper caste elite. Chomsky argues that this is a kind of pre-selection that happens of individuals who have internalized the constraints of the market forces, which in India also includes caste structures.
Caste is in India a pre-selection to an extent that even Chomsky can barely dream of. You know, what the market does or capital does is a very small portion given the kind of control. Caste, I always argue, is the basic framework on which Indian society operates. Dominance of the upper caste is a given. And when we talk of that dominance, we are talking actually of a dominance of basically the mercantile caste, what we would call the Banyas, and the intellectual priestly class, which is what we call the Brahmins. The newsroom is led and staffed, if you look at it, the percentage of Brahmins, not even when you look at upper caste, but if you look at the percentage of Brahmins, because intellectual capital is in the control of Brahmins in India, even more so today. You look at the university, etc., is this caste. And the traditional drivers of Hindutva in India has been this combination of the mercantile and the priestly caste.
Interests of the dominant elite, political interests, business interests, all of it goes back to media ownership. It is ownership patterns that necessitate the system serving those in power. But speaking of business interests, it takes us to the next filter of the propaganda model: funding. News media is a business enterprise, and businesses have economic imperatives. And what is the revenue model of news media in India? Advertisement with a capital A. It's simple. News media needs money to run, and you and I are not paying that money. Enter advertisers. So while advertisers might not have editorial control over content, they do decide which media organization they give their money to. And who are these advertisers? Governments and corporations. Yes, the power groups come back and so do their interests. In an ad-dependent revenue model, both compliance and dissent are rewarded and punished respectively. So if you're Dainik Bhaskar, one of the largest read newspapers in India, and you report on the collapse of government infrastructure during the second wave of the COVID pandemic, brace yourself for half of your government ad revenue disappearing. But if you're a Network 18 that toes the government line, program after program, year after year, then rejoice. You have topped the ad revenue charts. There's another aspect to the advertisement game in India: TRP. TRP is viewership data that measures TV audiences, and advertisers use these ratings to give ads. The higher your ratings, the more ads you get. So channels compete for these ratings or engage in rigging them. Competition means that news becomes less about public interest and more about what sells. And so you have sensationalism enter the picture. And in India's current political climate, polarization and hate. So funding too determines what private and government interests the media serves. Now, the government is not just a source of revenue. It is also a source of information for the media. Filter number 3, sourcing. The political establishment is a source of information: scoops, official accounts, exclusive interviews. Closeness to power determines who has how much access to this information. And so you have an Arnab Goswami in his leaked chats boasting about his close relations with the PMO. Or you have the group editor of the Times Now group flaunt a whole brigade of sitting cabinet ministers, including the Prime Minister, attend her son's wedding. Such close proximity with power comes with its terms and conditions. If you want access, then complicity is expected. And so in exchange of proximity, you have news personnel parrot the government's version and discredit a people's movement like the 2021 farmers' protest, or celebrate bad economic moves, or provide cover to a failed administration during a deadly pandemic, or even spread outright fake news around Indo-China border disputes. And thus, power centers manage and manipulate media narratives. Again, access journalism is not a new phenomenon. The government is a source of information. What is different, however, with the current political dispensation is the kind of exchange happening. While there is complicity, there's not really a lot of access.
Access journalism is part of journalism. You need to have access. You need to be able to approach people. The problem is when the access journalism becomes one way where your access to a politician means that you get favors from the politician and you do the news that the politician is providing. Even when journalists were aware of that some major corporate group is actually fiddling with cabinet formation, they were more interested in finding out the name of the cabinet minister rather than finding out which corporate was influencing which cabinet position, and they did not report it. This clearly there on the narratives. What is happening today is extreme magnification of this tendency, because what we are now seeing is not even access journalism. It is the complete control over the pipeline. This is spoon-fed journalism.
Compliance is maintained through other mechanisms of reward and punish, and in the name of access, you get memos of tweets to be copy-pasted or exclusive information about what your leader eats, how much he sleeps, or his superhuman tendencies.
क्या हमारे प्रधानमंत्री आम खाते हैं?
Why don't you get tired? आप थकते क्यों नहीं हैं?
प्रधानमंत्री मोदी वक्त के जबरदस्त पाबंद हैं। चाहे रात में कितनी भी देर तक जग रहे हों, लेकिन तड़के ही जग जाते हैं।
मोदी की मेहनत का राज क्या है?
20 घंटे काम और 4 घंटे आराम।
Reducing mainstream media to a servile PR spouting machine running propaganda campaigns. And so you have media baron Arun Puri at his own 2023 India Today conclave, sharing the stage with the Prime Minister. But at this media event, the only thing he has to say to a Prime Minister who has never held a press conference is not a question, but a meek complaint about lack of access.
आप बुरा न मानो तो मैं एक बात कहना चाहता हूँ। मीडिया आपके सरकार से बड़ी परेशान है। आपकी सरकार से कोई जानकारी लीक नहीं होती, जैसे पहले सरकारों से होती थी।
And then in true Orwellian doublespeak, the Prime Minister advises the media not to work under any pressure.
किसी के प्रेशर में ना आए, बैलेंसिंग के चक्कर में ये मौका न गवाएं।
In a system where only compliance is rewarded with access, and sometimes not even that, any challenge to power will have its consequences. And so we have the fourth filter, flak. When the media doesn't toe the narrative of power, it gets flak. Negative repercussions, which can be financial, editorial, where your credibility is made suspect, or the government can unleash its agencies against you. In India, the current political establishment is particularly tight-gripped over the media. It's an establishment that has teams tabulating in Excel sheets who speaks for and against them. And so you have a big section of the media itself that acts as an extended hand of power and suppresses any form of dissent. The government discredits international reports and big media follows suit. Elected autocracy, we don't need their approval. Lack of religious freedom, motivated and biased. Low ranking on Press Freedom Index, questionable methodology. Then there's Arnab Goswami dismissing Western media outlets like the NYT or the Washington Post for being anti-India, or anchors who defame a young climate activist during the farmers' movement, or the spectacle that unfolds every night on primetime, diverting the audiences from any real issues. The coverage of political opposition can also be a powerful means of censure. And so you have legacy media either dismiss it, mock it, or erase it. And finally, there is the occasional ED raid or survey of news organizations that dare tiptoe over the line, or FIRs and terror charges against journalists as deterring examples. It's all flak. Dismiss, discredit, divert. And all of this is set to be done in the name of the larger cause called national interest. Which brings us to the final filter of the propaganda model. The other, the enemy. Any ideology that speaks of national interest requires an opponent, an antagonist, a villain. The self needs the other to exist. In the American context Herman and Chomsky were writing in, it was communism. For us in India, with the dominance of Hindu nationalism, the boogeyman keeps changing faces. On odd days, it can be the arch enemy Pakistan.
I consider your country to be my enemy. I am saying so on television.
On even days, it can be the in-house anti-nationals, the left brigade or the liberal gang.
जेएनयू में देश विरोधी नारे लगे थे.
But on all days, it must also be the Muslim. Given the virulent political climate in India that is openly anti-Muslim, big media mirrors this sentiment, and you have unabashed demonization of Muslims on Indian television. They are violent, they spread COVID, they're regressive, they are...
जमात के लोगों ने कोरोना बॉम्ब का काम किया है.
क्या छोटा परिवार सुखी परिवार की थ्योरी अपनाने के लिए मुसलमान रेडी हैं? तो सवाल है कि क्या ये लव जिहाद का जानलेवा पैटर्न है?
आज हाई अलर्ट में करने जा रहे हैं खुलासा धर्मांतरण गैंग के पूरे नेटवर्क का कि कैसे उमर गौतम ने कानपुर में अपना नेटवर्क खड़ा किया.
उसके बाद लैंड जिहाद है जिसे हम जमीन जिहाद कह रहे हैं. मजार जिहाद क्यों हो रहा है और कैसे हो रहा है?
All kinds of prejudice used to perpetuate fear, paranoia, and hate. And so polarizing is this discourse that the constant positioning of Muslims as a threat is simultaneously pitted against Hindus as victims, a dichotomy that serves who? And so we come full circle. The media as an institution that plays by the book and serves those in power. Information that reaches you first passes through these 5 filters. It is controlled by political and business interests, a crooked revenue model, a required degree of compliance, all of which work together to manufacture your consent. And even though we're looking at examples of an overly toxic media because India is in a particularly dystopian phase of its media history, the propaganda model is applicable to the entire spectrum of news media. Liberal media too sets the limits of its discourse. Here's a good example. The endorsement of liberalization policies in the 1990s. There was a media consensus on how great liberalization was that primarily served the interests of the dominant elite, including the media businesses themselves. Or you only have to pick up the national newspapers and see the number and frequency with which leaders of the governing party and its ideological parent are given space as opinion writers. Or the media discourse on terrorism in India that is in lockstep with the state, uncritically reproducing police versions and prejudice, where terrorism is almost always Islamic and the Muslim almost always suspect. Or just the very language with which it speaks at times, where the targeted violence against Muslims in Delhi 2020 becomes clashes reduced to a false equivalence of both sides involved. Again, speaking in tune with the state by flattening unequal power dynamics. In fact, Chomsky says that right-wing media is easy to discern. It is liberal media that serves the system more effectively.
Propaganda model, both liberal and conservative wings of the media, whatever those terms are supposed to mean, fall within the same framework of assumptions. In fact, if the system functions well, it ought to have a liberal bias, or at least appear to, because if it appears to have a liberal bias, that will serve to bound thought even more effectively.
So is it all doom and gloom? Are we condemned to being indoctrinated? The propaganda model has faced its fair share of criticism. As it punctures the democratic idea of news media as a check on power, critics have called it too simplistic a framework, or too pessimistic, or too deterministic. They argue that the media has way more complex power dynamics. Journalists and organizations are diverse, competitive, and have certain autonomy and independence. The events they cover, they're not all the same. Then what about journalistic objectivity? And what about the resistance to this dominance? Resistance from both within the media and outside of it. If there is narrative hegemony, what about counter-hegemony? The propaganda model does not explain everything about the media, and it doesn't claim to. Herman argues that it analyzes the behavior of the media, not its effects. And it gives you a framework of structural factors that govern this behavior. So it doesn't mean that there is no pushing back of propaganda. There is the resistance of alternate media, countercultures, and other forms of public opposition. It doesn't mean that there is no journalistic objectivity or good journalists. You have great journalists out there. But that's not the point. The point is that the systematic behavior of the media has functional limits. The model is not so much about individuals or organizations, but about a market system of control.
That when you have corporate ownership, we also in India have not built in safeguards where journalists are insulated from ownership so that if an owner owns a journalistic organization, the owner can't dictate what that journalistic organization does. Because of this, owners can virtually decide the editorial line of the organizations they run, and senior editors mostly are managerial appointees. So these organizations are doing basically what is the corporate interest of the owners. And when the owner's interest is the interest of the government, then this so-called free media is not free at all, it is not private at all, it is basically a means of propaganda of the government.
So if such is the system, then how does one resist? Invest in media literacy and media criticism. Be critical thinkers. Always have multiple sources and contribute towards building a mediascape that's as diverse and plural as possible. Want to hear Dalit voices? Support them. Want to hear Muslim voices? Support them. In the end, there will always be a constant negotiation with the media. Life is complicated and there are often no straight answers. In some cases, however, there are straight answers.
उठा के फेंक दीजिए टीवी को घर से बाहर, ना मोबाइल में देखिए ना दीवार पर चिपका के देखिए। 2 महीना तो नहीं देख सकते ना, इतना तो कर सकते हैं। इससे आसान डेमोक्रेसी के लिए मैं क्या मांग रहा हूं आप